report by Human Rights Watch has sounded the alarm over efforts by rich countries to reserve future COVID-19 vaccine doses for their own exclusive use. The document calls for governments using public money to fund the research and develop any vaccines to openly share their progress. Human Rights Watch has flagged secret deals and backdoor agreements as attempts by the privileged to secure vaccines for their own use and not make it globally available for everyone. Currently, there are 10 vaccines in the final stages of clinical trials, and in fact, governments have spent an estimated $12 billion on COVID-19 related research. For more on this now, let's bring in Aruna Kashyap. She's a senior human rights counsel and co-author of this human rights report. She joins us, in fact, from Mumbai in India. Aruna, thanks very much for your time and welcome to the AM report in South Africa. The document is aptly titled in part, "Whoever finds the vaccine must share it." It's a call that's been made by the World Health Organization for months now, and there's absolutely no overstating why it's absolutely crucial that something like that does happen.
Absolutely. I think the key thing in our report is that governments that have the resources to fund the research and development of vaccines, which is governments, rich governments, have the human rights obligation to share the benefits of that scientific research with all countries across the world, regardless of whether those countries have the ability to pay for such vaccines, vaccine research and development. And a key part of that sharing is taking away all of the intellectual property rights barriers to sharing, so to make the vaccines as widely available and affordable to everybody possible.
Yeah, and what do we know about these bilateral opaque deals that are taking place behind the scenes? I mean, can you give us an idea of some of the countries involved in some of this alleged behavior?
Yes, I mean, some of the top governments, and there was a report in September by Oxfam that showed that a handful of governments, for example, Australia, Hong Kong, Israel, Japan, Switzerland, UK, US, I mean, these are among the governments that have pre-booked the highest number of doses for their populations, booking about 50% of over the 5 vaccine candidates that Oxfam had analyzed, even though these governments represented only about 13% of the world's population. So you can imagine if some of these rich governments that can afford to do so are pre-booking, vast supplies of future doses of vaccines that will be proven to be safe and effective, then what will happen to other governments in more populous regions of the world, and how will they access the vaccine? I mean, that's the key question we're asking. And a key part of this is that whatever governments are funding the research and development have to do so in a way that centers human rights and transparency. A key challenge today is that governments that are funding vaccines and other, global procurement efforts, they're not publishing the contracts that they're signing with companies and universities and research institutes for these vaccines, as a result of which we don't know, for example, what they're pre-booking, to what extent. Are there any clauses in these contracts that make these companies share equitably, or will the vaccine just simply go to the highest bidder?
Yeah. And of course, these governments are making these deals with these conglomerates, these major pharmaceutical companies. How much pressure should be directed to those establishments too, to ensure, of course, that they don't create an environment where this unfair, unethical behavior can flourish?
Yes, I think it's the responsibility of businesses to have responsibilities under what we call the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, to make sure that their business is conducted in a responsible way and does not have adverse public health outcomes for other countries. But the primary responsibility and the power that vests with governments to regulate companies, all governments should exercise it. For example, a handful of governments like Germany they've introduced compulsory licensing laws after the pandemic was declared. And I think all governments, including governments like South Africa, should also use their regulatory powers to make sure that whatever vaccines are proven to be safe and effective, and if there are patents that are coming in the way of making these vaccines available, should be compulsorily licensed in country. South Africa and India are championing, removal of intellectual property rights barriers internationally, and these governments are well placed to do the same domestically.
Yeah, and why do you think they're not doing that yet, Aruna? Is it a lack of political will? Is it sheer greed, a disregard for certain lives as they are more important than others? What's at the heart of what appears to be again an incredibly unethical way of responding to a global health crisis that's affected all of us in very similar ways?
I think what is happening is that there has been a lot of competition and secrecy surrounding, vaccine research and development and access, and an approach where, to each her own or his own kind of approach to vaccines. And that's fundamentally a flawed approach, which it just completely disregards people's lives, health, and livelihoods across the world. And if there's anything that the pandemic has shown, it is how interconnected we all are, that jobs in one part of the world, the supply chain in one part of the world affects another part of the world, travel, entertainment, manufacturing, all of these are so deeply interconnected that protecting any one country's people alone is not going to at all allow all of us and the world and the economies to recover from the pandemic. And I think a realization that people and their lives and livelihoods should come first and not corporate profits has to be central to any vaccine strategy.
Yeah. Of course, low to middle income countries also have a level of agency in this. Is there anything that they're doing to either safeguard themselves or push back against this trend of these, again, rich countries taking place in this backdoor dealing, for lack of a better term?
The champions who are politically calling for sharing of vaccine technology and know-how and IP, they're all mostly from low and middle income countries. I mean, for example, Costa Rica has championed, along with 40 other governments, they've together championed something called the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool that is led by the World Health Organization. But we're not getting a lot of uptake from rich governments, and that's the key. Rich governments have to support efforts like the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool and not only look out for their own populations. A lot of the low and middle income countries are also seeing that perhaps the one way for them to get access to vaccines is by participating in clinical trials, and that's been happening. Again, I think it's unclear whether people participating in clinical trials will actually have access to these vaccines. What is the priority access? What are these deals and clauses and these contracts that are being signed by governments? There's really no clarity. I think there's a lot of sleuthing around by journalists and researchers, as activists have pointed out, that's the only way so far that people are getting information about who may have access, but there's no real guaranteed access to low and middle income countries. And I think that's a key question to keep asking. And one of the key things to push for everybody's benefit is transparency.
Absolutely, an important complex as we deal with COVID-19 that we should all watch quite closely. Thanks very much for giving us your insight on this important issue. Aruna Kashyap is a senior human rights counsel with Human Rights Watch. Thanks very much indeed for your time.